Can you just explain the basics of what these researchers found?
Absolutely. A little bit of background on it is that a lot of gun policy and gun policy research is premised on the idea that we know how prevalent firearms ownership is in the United States, roughly how many gun owners there are and how many guns there are. That's not necessarily true, even though it's a widespread assumption. And delving into the how true is it element was the basis of this particular study. It comes out of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center at Rutgers University. They surveyed 3,500 people. And what they wanted to see was how truthful are people being when they ask them, do you own a gun? And they broke the group down, not just demographically, but in terms of the responses, into about roughly 1,200 people who said, yes, I'm a gun owner. Then they came up with the rest who said, no, I don't own a gun. And what they did was that they took common responses to a variety of questions about attitudes and policies that you could apply across the group that admitted to owning firearms. And they said, okay, let's look at the non-gun owners and let's see if we can apply these to them and find out if there are people who said they're not gun owners who actually look more like gun owners. And they did. And they came up with the idea that depending upon the level of probability, that is how certain you are about your analysis, anywhere between 220 and a little over 1,000 of the respondents who said they did not own guns almost certainly did. And that's absolutely fascinating to look at. Troubling for the researchers, which they went into over and over again in their paper, but it has huge implications for policy, has huge implications for lawmaking, and also for how accurate gun research is across the United States. Because if people are lying about who they are and what their status is with regard to guns, it means the researchers don't know as much as they think they do.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that sums it up pretty well as far as why this matters, right? Why people should care, because it's actually, there was some talk about this when it came out. It sort of reinforces this idea that you've seen in the gun rights movement or among gun owners for a long time, that basically polling on how many people own guns is not accurate because people don't trust pollsters and they won't tell them that they own guns. Oh, I lost my guns in the boating accident. This is a common, super common line that you hear. And so people looked at that as, well, all right, here's evidence that this is true. This thing we've been saying for a long time is true. But I think it goes way beyond just that. There's a lot more to suss out as far as the impact of this particular study. There's a lot to it. And, it's interesting. I spoke with Allison Bond. She's the lead researcher for this paper. And we did a piece where I interviewed her and we talked about the results. And, she was describing how this came about, right? Because, you mentioned there how they did the study. But it turned out that they were already doing this questionnaire. This was already happening. This happened in 2020. And it wasn't like they didn't request this survey to be done for this study. They were already doing this survey for different research purpose. And then one of the questions they asked is whether people were a gun owner, and they found the typical range that you would get from most major public polling, which is about a third of people said that they personally owned a gun. But they then heard of research with veterans actually on whether somebody is having suicidal ideation or has ever had suicidal ideation. And there'd been research done that showed some veterans or military members were perhaps withholding this. They wouldn't identify that they'd had these thoughts. And there was research done to try and figure out how many people perhaps were withholding in that way, using the same sort of method that you just described there. And so they thought, well, why don't we do that with gun owners and try to get an idea of how many people are holding back whether or not they own guns from researchers. And then these were the conclusions they came to. And yeah, like you said, there's quite a lot of implications just so wide ranging. What do you think is going to be perhaps the most important one area to focus on with the outcome of this study?
Well, there's actually a lot of import to this. It's a pretty big deal if you find out that your research into the prevalence of any major social phenomenon is not accurate. One of the bigger implications, though, is that lawmaking in this country, and we have a deeply polarized country, a lot of lawmaking, frankly, has come to be punitive. That is, people sponsor laws not necessarily because they want to achieve a policy goal or stamp out a social ill, but because they want to punish a segment of the population that they don't perceive as the part of their political base. And if an activity or a product or a service is associated with an ideological or a partisan affiliation, it's easy to punish people of that ideological partisan affiliation, which would be unconstitutional in itself, by going after the activity, good, or service instead. So one way of punishing, say, if you're conservatives, if you're on the left, is to go after firearms. Conservatives might go after Teslas if they want to punish liberals. The same idea. So there's big implications here, but that only works if it's true, if gun ownership is really something that can be associated with those on the political right. We've seen a lot of changes in that in recent years. We know there was a surge in gun purchases across, in recent years because of social disorder, because of the pandemic, because of perceptions the country's kind of coming apart at the seams. A lot of the new buyers have been women. A lot of them have been people of color, urban African Americans in particular. And this study, one of the things they found was that almost half of those they identified as saying that they did not own a firearm, but were likely actual firearm owners who were responding falsely, were unmarried women of color living in cities. And that's exactly who you would identify as among the surge of new gun owners, people who are characteristic of those who were not traditionally seen as being firearms friendly, but as gun ownership spreads across the population, have joined their ranks. And that means that it's no longer safe then necessarily to target an ideological group by going after a product, guns in this case, because you'll end up hurting your own political base if you assume that those people, if you assume that urban women of color are actually more likely to vote for you than to vote for someone you perceived as an opponent. So that's a big implication right there. It's no longer safe to target a good if you want to punish an enemy in this case.